On release day, he didn't fight the cage. He fought the loneliness waiting beyond it. Everyone at the rescue thought it was just another release, a bobcat healed and ready to go home to the wild. But when the cage door opened, he froze, staring toward the room where a tiny kitten was crying. No one could explain why he refused to leave, until the vets discovered the heartbreaking reason that left them in tears. The morning at Silverpine Wildlife Rescue broke with a pale sheet of mist rising off the pines. The air smelled of wet cedar and thawing earth, a scent that only existed in this far northern corner of Washington. Inside the main enclosure, the bobcat known as Ranger paced along the fence line, his muscles rolling under his russet coat like slow waves. He had been here for almost 6 months, long enough for the staff to stop jumping each time he hissed, long enough for the wildness in his eyes to settle into something quieter, but no less fierce. Dr. Nora Hayes stood at the observation window, arms crossed over her khaki jacket. She was 52, with lines etched deep at the corners of her mouth, the kind that came from years of holding her emotions in check. Behind her, the coffee on her desk had gone cold, forgotten since dawn rounds. She'd been with Silverpine for 25 years and had learned one truth that never failed her. Animals healed in their own time, and humans could only make the space for it to happen. Ranger was proof of that. He had been found last winter caught in an illegal trap high up near the timberline. The metal jaws had torn into his hind leg, and by the time the hikers who found him got him here, he was half dead from infection. It took 3 surgeries, weeks of antibiotics, and a small miracle to keep him alive. Even now, the scar on his leg shone faintly beneath his thick fur, a pale reminder of pain survived. Nora scribbled a note on her clipboard. Weight steady, muscle tone excellent, release scheduled for 0900 tomorrow. Her voice was brisk, but a hint of warmth softened the edges. She always talked while she worked, as if narrating the story for the animals who couldn't answer back. Across the yard, Ethan Cole was filling water bowls. He was younger, 31, but already carried the quiet patience of someone twice his age. A former medic in the Marines, he'd joined the rescue after leaving the service 3 years earlier. Animals, he once said, were easier to save than people. He gave a small nod to Ranger through the wire. Morning, buddy. Big day coming, huh? Ranger paused mid-step, head tilting slightly, ears twitching at the sound of Ethan's voice. His amber eyes met Ethan's through the mesh. It wasn't affection exactly, more like recognition. The way wild things sometimes acknowledge the humans who have earned the right to be near them. Nora walked out to the pen, pulling her jacket tight against the wind. How's he looking? Strong, Ethan said. A little restless. He should be, she replied. Tomorrow he's free. Ethan smiled faintly. Think he knows? Maybe. They always sense when the cage is about to open. She crouched near the fence, watching Ranger settle back onto his haunches. His tail flicked once, slow and deliberate. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The forest beyond the enclosure stretched for miles, dense spruce, alder, and the dark thread of the Stillwater River winding through it. That's where Ranger would go. Out there, the air would taste of prey and danger, and the kind of silence no human could understand. Everything's ready at the site? She asked. Yep. The wildlife officer's meeting us at the ridge. I checked the GPS tags twice. Good. Nora stood, brushing pine needles from her knees. I'll file the final release papers before lunch. As she turned to go, Ethan lingered by the fence. Ranger had returned to pacing, a restless loop that had worn a faint path in the dirt. His gaze followed Ethan's every movement, intense but unreadable. There was something in it, a flicker, maybe, of unease. When the sun climbed higher, the center came to life. A truck from the state office arrived with feed supplies. Volunteers hosed down kennels and refilled medical trays. Silverpine was small but orderly, each sound a part of its rhythm. The clatter of metal pans, the calls of ravens in the tree line, the low hum of the generator. Yet beneath it all ran a strange current that Ethan couldn't quite name. By noon, Nora finished her reports and joined Ethan for a quick break under the eaves. "You've done good work with him," she said, nodding toward the enclosure. "He did most of it himself," Ethan replied. "I just kept him fed and stitched." "You kept him alive," she corrected. Then, after a pause, "Don't get too attached. He's not like the others." He glanced at her. "You mean he won't remember us?" "I mean he shouldn't," she said softly. "If he does, we've failed." A gust of wind swept through the yard, scattering the paper napkins from their lunch. Nora caught one before it flew away and smiled tiredly. "Go on. Give him one last check this evening. I'll meet you at the ridge tomorrow at 7. When she left, Ethan stayed behind, leaning against the fence. Ranger sat a few yards away, ears flicking at the forest sounds. The light caught his fur, bringing out the faint silver undercoat that had inspired his name. "You'll be fine out there," Ethan said quietly. "Just stay away from traps." The bobcat blinked, slow and deliberate, as if the words had reached him somehow. Then he turned and vanished into the corner shadow of the enclosure, where the pines cast long bars of light across the dirt. That evening, the rescue settled into its familiar hush. The volunteers went home, leaving only the night staff and the distant croak of frogs. In the main office, Nora reviewed the release checklist one final time. Every box was marked, every permit cleared. It was, by all measures, a perfect case, an animal rescued, healed, and ready to return to the wild. Still, when she switched off the desk lamp, she found herself pausing at the window. Out there in the dark, Ranger moved like a ghost behind the fence. For a heartbeat, their eyes met through the reflection of the glass. Hers, tired and human, his sharp and ancient. Tomorrow, she thought, would be the end of one story and the beginning of another. But as the first drops of rain began to tap against the metal roof, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen had already begun to stir in the night. Something small, fragile, and destined to change everything she thought she knew about wild and tame, about reason and heart. She drew the blinds and went to lock up, unaware that beyond the gate, under the rumble of thunder, a faint cry was already threading through the rain. Outside the rescue center, the forest was drenched in darkness. The storm rolled in fast from the mountains, sheets of rain slanting across the gravel drive. Lightning flickered behind the ridge, carving quick silver scars through the sky. The wind carried the scent of wet pine and mud, and somewhere in it, just barely audible between the thunderclaps, came that cry again. Thin, wavering, almost human in its desperation. At first, the night guard thought it was the squeal of an injured bird. He turned up the collar of his slicker and went to close the outer gate, his flashlight bouncing across puddles. But then he heard it again. Closer this time. A kitten's cry, high and fragile, coming from beneath the delivery truck parked by the entrance. He crouched low, shining his light underneath. Two golden eyes blinked back at him, wide with terror. A small white kitten, soaked through and trembling, crouched against the tire. Its fur clung to its skin, and its sides rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths. The guard tried to coax it out, murmuring softly, but the animal flinched from every sound. He hesitated only a moment before pulling out his radio. Ethan? You still around? I've got something out here you might want to see." Inside, Ethan had just finished covering Ranger's enclosure for the night when the call came through. He grabbed his raincoat and stepped into the downpour, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the dark. When he reached the gate, the guard was already kneeling by the truck. "It's just a kitten," he said. "Looks half dead. Don't know where it came from." Ethan knelt beside him. The kitten barely moved, its fur matted with mud, one paw tucked under as if injured. He could see the faint shimmer of a small bell on its collar, though the strap was frayed and stained with rust. "Hey, little one," he whispered. "It's okay. You're safe now." He reached out slowly, letting his hand rest on the wet gravel near the kitten. The tiny creature sniffed once, then, as if too tired to resist, let him lift it into his hands. It was no heavier than a handful of wet leaves. The kitten's body shivered against his palm, so cold that he could feel it through the gloves. Without another word, Ethan zipped the kitten inside his jacket, close to his chest, and ran through the rain toward the main building. When Nora opened the door, her first reaction was confusion. "What in the world?" "Found it under the truck," Ethan said, pushing back his hood. Rain streamed down his face, his voice rough with urgency. "It's freezing. We can't leave it out there." Nora glanced at the bundle against his chest. The kitten's small head poked out just long enough for her to see the hollow cheeks, the dull, cloudy eyes. She sighed. "Ethan, you know the policy. We don't take in domestic animals." "I know," he said quickly, "but there's no one else open tonight. The shelter in town's flooded. They called earlier." He didn't add what she could already see, that if they sent it away, it wouldn't survive the night. Nora rubbed a hand across her brow. "Fine," she said finally. "Treatment room 2. We'll keep it warm and hydrated until morning, then call the county vet." Ethan smiled, relief breaking through his exhaustion. "Thank you, Doc." They moved fast. He laid the kitten on a towel under the bright overhead light, while Nora fetched the emergency kit. Up close, it was worse than he thought. The kitten's breathing was shallow, its gums pale. It couldn't have been more than 3 weeks old, too young to be separated from its mother. Nora took its temperature, her tone softening despite herself. "Severely hypothermic. Let's get warm fluids and start slow feeding. What's its name?" Ethan blinked. "Didn't think that far." "Then we need something to call it," she said, wrapping the kitten in a fleece cloth. "Names matter." He looked at the tiny form trembling in her hands, the faint sound of a mew escaping its throat. "Whisper," he said, after a pause, "because that's all it's got left." Nora nodded once, the corner of her mouth lifting. "Whisper it is." They worked for over an hour, feeding it drop by drop, massaging its tiny paws to bring circulation back. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, a rhythm of life beating time against the quiet hum of the incubator. By midnight, the kitten's breathing had evened out. It slept, curled in the blanket, a soft white shape under the glow of the heat lamp. Ethan leaned against the counter, drenched and bone-tired, but unwilling to leave. Nora cleaned up the instruments, her movements slower now. "It's stable, but it's not out of danger," she said. "We'll check again at dawn. Try to get some rest." "I'll stay," he said, "just for the night." She didn't argue. She saw something in his face, a kind of quiet protectiveness that mirrored her own, the same thing that had kept her in this job long after others would have burned out. "Fine. Keep the lamp steady at 95. If the temp drops, call me." When she left, Ethan pulled a stool close to the incubator. The kitten stirred once, then nestled deeper into the towel. Its fur, now drying, glowed faintly gold under the lamp. The storm outside raged harder. Through the window, lightning flashed across the hills, turning the pines into a forest of silver spears. In the enclosure beyond, Ranger was awake. Ethan noticed the faint movement through the glass, a shape pacing near the far corner. He stood, stepping closer to the window. The bobcat's eyes caught the light, burning like twin embers in the dark. Ranger wasn't pacing aimlessly. His head was turned toward the treatment room, ears pricked, body taut. "What are you looking at?" Ethan murmured, following his gaze back to the incubator. The kitten shifted in its sleep, letting out a tiny squeak, a sound so faint he barely heard it. Out in the enclosure, Ranger froze. Then, slowly, he pressed himself against the fence, muscles rigid, tail flicking once. He let out a low, rolling sound deep in his throat, not the snarl of a predator, but something softer, unfamiliar. Ethan frowned. That's new. He watched for a long moment, uncertain what to make of it. The storm muffled all other noise, but that sound, that faint, throaty vibration, carried through the glass as if the distance between the wild and the tame no longer existed. By 2 a.m., the rain had eased into a steady drizzle. Ethan dimmed the lights, leaving only the glow of the incubator. Whisper slept soundly now, her small chest rising and falling. Before turning in, he went out to check on Ranger one last time. The bobcat stood near the fence, head lowered, eyes half closed as if listening to something only he could hear. "Easy, boy," Ethan said softly. "Tomorrow's your big day." Ranger blinked, and for an instant, Ethan could swear the animal understood. Then the bobcat turned, padding silently back to his shelter box. When Ethan finally lay down on the cot in the corner of the office, he left the door cracked open, the faint warmth of the incubator spilling into the dark. The scent of wet earth lingered in the air, mixed with the quiet hum of machines and the steady breathing of two survivors, one wild, one helpless. Outside, the clouds began to break. A thin line of pale light glowed along the horizon, a promise of morning. But neither Ethan nor Nora could have known what that dawn would bring, or how the simple act of saving one small life would unravel everything they believed about the boundary between instinct and love. In the silence after the storm, the first bird called from the trees. Whisper shifted under her blanket and made a faint sound, the tiniest echo of the forest beyond. And somewhere in his enclosure, Ranger lifted his head and answered. By the time the sun crested the ridge, Silverpine was quiet again, wrapped in that strange stillness that comes after a long night of rain. The pines dripped steadily, the gravel paths glistened with puddles, and the smell of wet bark filled the air. Inside the treatment room, Ethan was already awake. He hadn't slept much. The rhythm of the incubator had kept him half-conscious through the night. When Whisper stirred, he rose, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. "Morning, little one," he said softly. The kitten blinked up at him, eyes clearer now, a faint spark of life flickering there. She mewed weakly. Ethan smiled, mixing a small batch of milk formula. "That's what I like to hear." When Nora arrived an hour later, she found him perched on the edge of the counter, the kitten nestled in a towel on his lap. "You didn't leave?" she asked, eyebrows lifting. "Didn't want her waking up alone," Ethan replied, feeding the kitten drop by drop. Nora shook her head, but the corners of her mouth softened. "You're impossible." She leaned over to check Whisper's temperature. "She's stable. Good work." They both jumped when a loud thump echoed from the back of the facility. Nora frowned. That came from Ranger's pen. Ethan set the bottle down and followed her down the hall. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in the air. When they reached the enclosure, they found Ranger pacing in tight circles, tail lashing. His food bowl lay overturned, the meat untouched. "Something's got him riled," Ethan said. Ranger's gaze snapped toward them, his eyes wide, ears forward. Then, without warning, he let out a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the air. A low, rolling chuff, the kind a mother bobcat makes to call her young. Ethan froze. "You hear that?" Nora nodded slowly. "That's unusual." They watched as Ranger moved toward the fence, stopping just short of the metal mesh. He stood perfectly still, listening. From down the hall came a faint mew, whisper, calling out again from the treatment room. The moment the sound reached him, Ranger let out another chuff, softer this time, almost tender. Ethan glanced at Nora, disbelief flickering across his face. He's answering her. Nora's rational mind kicked in. Coincidence, she said quickly. She's vocalizing. He's responding to the sound. That's all. Maybe, Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. The kitten cried again. Ranger pressed closer to the fence, his body tense, eyes locked in the direction of the sound. He didn't bare his teeth or hiss. He just stood there, muscles taut, emitting that strange, rumbling call again and again. Nora stepped back. Whatever this is, it's not normal. We need to keep them separated. But separation was easier said than done. Over the next several hours, Whisper grew stronger and louder. Each time she mewed, Ranger reacted the same way. He'd lift his head, let out a chuff, and pace along the fence until the sound faded. When Ethan cleaned the pen that afternoon, Ranger ignored him completely, his attention fixed on the treatment building. He's not eating, Ethan reported later. Hasn't touched his feed all day. Nora frowned at the chart. He's stressed. Maybe the storm unsettled him. Ethan hesitated. Or maybe... He stopped himself. Never mind. She looked up. Or maybe what? He met her gaze. Or maybe he's worried about her. Nora exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Ethan, you know better than that. Wild animals don't worry. They react to stimuli, not emotions. Then how do you explain this? He asked quietly. He's not behaving like any bobcat I've ever seen. He's protective, almost gentle. Gentle doesn't mean emotional. Don't start romanticizing it. She turned back to her desk, but her voice had lost its usual conviction. That night, long after the other staff had gone home, Ethan sat again in the treatment room with Whisper. The kitten was stronger now, able to stand for brief moments before collapsing into his palm. Her fur was soft and downy, white as snow except for a faint gray patch near her ear. He caught movement through the small window that looked toward Ranger's enclosure. The bobcat was awake, pacing in the glow of the floodlight. Ethan stepped closer to the glass. You can't see her from here, can you? He murmured. Ranger stopped pacing and looked directly toward him, eyes burning like amber coals. Then came that sound again, the same low, throaty purr that seemed to vibrate through the wall. Whisper stirred in the incubator, tiny ears twitching. Ethan felt a chill run through him. He wasn't imagining it. They were responding to each other. He called Nora on the intercom. Doc, you might want to see this. When she arrived, he pointed toward the window. Watch. As if on cue, Whisper gave a soft cry. Ranger immediately answered with a chuff, pressing close to the fence. Nora stared, speechless for a moment. He's calling to her. Told you, Ethan said softly. She shook her head, still watching. But why? Ranger lay down by the gate, head on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. Every few minutes he'd emit that same sound, gentle, rhythmic, like a heartbeat, whispers, tiny body relaxed each time, her breathing slowing. It's like he's calming her, Ethan said. Nora drew in a slow breath. That's impossible. Is it? She didn't answer. She just stood there, caught between disbelief and awe. For all her years of medical training, all her devotion to logic, she couldn't deny what she was seeing. Something was passing between them, something wordless, older than science. At dawn, when the staff arrived, they found Ranger lying exactly where he'd been all night, his fur damp with dew, Whisper was sleeping peacefully for the first time since she'd arrived. Nora rubbed her temples, exhausted. "We'll document the behavior," she told Ethan. "But that's all. We can't start attributing emotions. It's a slippery slope." Ethan nodded, though his eyes lingered on the kitten. "Sure, whatever you say." The day went on, but the pattern repeated. Each cry, each mew, each faint tremor of sound from the treatment room drew an answering call from Ranger. Other animals in the facility seemed agitated by it. The owls fluttered in their cages, and even the foxes grew restless. By late afternoon, Nora gave in to curiosity and brought a small recorder to Ranger's enclosure. She crouched near the fence, noting the tone, the rhythm, the intervals. "This isn't aggression," she murmured. "It's communication." Ethan stood beside her. "What now?" "We watch," she said, "and we wait." That evening, a soft fog drifted down from the hills, wrapping the rescue in silence. Whisper slept under the lamp, her tiny paws twitching in dreams. Outside, Ranger sat motionless by the fence, watching the window glow of the treatment room. Nora stood there for a long time before finally turning away. "He's supposed to be wild," she said quietly. "But maybe wild isn't what we think it is." Ethan looked at her, then at the bobcat. Maybe not. Neither of them noticed the faint sound that came next. A single fragile purr from inside the incubator, answered instantly by the deep, steady rumble from outside. In that strange duet of breath and instinct, the line between wild and tame blurred completely, and the world, just for a moment, felt smaller, softer, and entirely new. The following morning, Silver Pine Wildlife Rescue stirred to life under a sky washed pale with spring light. The storm had scrubbed the air clean. Everything smelled sharp, alive, and new. But inside the facility, tension hung heavier than the mist outside. Nora was at her desk before sunrise, her coffee untouched and her pen tapping against a clipboard. She'd spent most of the night replaying the scene in her head, the kitten's faint mews, Ranger's impossible responses. Logic told her it was coincidence. Her instincts whispered otherwise, and that bothered her more than anything. She'd built a career on being rational, not sentimental. When Ethan walked in, his jacket damp from morning chores, she didn't look up. "We can't let this continue." He blinked. "Let what continue?" She finally met his gaze. "Whatever's happening between Ranger and that kitten, it's interfering with his behavior. He's supposed to be released tomorrow." Ethan leaned against the counter. "With respect, Doc, maybe that's not such a bad thing. He's calm, focused." "He's dependent," Nora corrected sharply. "That's not calm, that's conditioning. You want him to survive out there, not sit by a tree waiting for a house cat to meow." Ethan didn't argue right away. He just glanced toward the window that looked out onto Ranger's enclosure. The bobcat was pacing again, slow and deliberate, his eyes flicking toward the hallway where the treatment room lay. "He's not acting like a captive animal either," Ethan said quietly. "You've seen him with the others. Never a sign of submission. He's choosing this." "Wild animals don't choose," Nora snapped. Then softer. "They respond. That's all." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Ethan noticed. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Fear that something was happening beyond her control. "Fine," she said finally. "Move the kitten to the east wing, farther from the enclosures. We'll start weaning her from the heat lamp today. It's time to separate them." Ethan hesitated, glancing toward the incubator. "She's barely stable." "She'll manage," Nora said, standing. "Do it before the next feeding." By mid-morning, Whisper had been relocated to a quieter treatment room down the hall. The incubator's hum filled the space, steady but lonely. Ethan lingered longer than necessary, adjusting the temperature, smoothing the blanket. Whisper mewed once, a soft, uncertain sound that tugged at something in his chest. From the far end of the corridor, a low, mournful growl rippled through the air. Ethan looked toward the sound. Ranger was calling again, louder this time, his voice carrying through the building like an echo. Within minutes, the entire facility seemed to feel it. Birds in the rehabilitation cages fluttered and shrieked. A fox kit yipped nervously. Even the older owls rustled their wings. Ethan walked quickly to Ranger's enclosure. The bobcat was agitated, tail twitching, fur along his shoulders raised. He prowled the fence line, calling in that deep, rhythmic way, eyes searching. "She's fine," Ethan said softly through the mesh. "She's just in another room." Ranger pressed closer to the fence, his pupils wide. He let out a low, guttural sound that wasn't aggression. It was distress. Ethan reached for the gate latch, then stopped himself. He knew better. The staff protocols were strict. No unnecessary contact. Still, he crouched low, resting his palm against the metal. "She's safe, you hear me? She's safe." For a moment, Ranger stilled. The wild tension in his muscles eased just slightly. Then, as if remembering the empty space beyond the walls, he resumed pacing, restless as a trapped current of wind. When Nora came to check an hour later, she found Ethan still there. "He hasn't eaten?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not since the move." Her expression hardened. "Then we keep them apart. He'll adjust." Ethan looked up, frustration flashing in his eyes. "And if he doesn't?" "Then we deal with it," she said. "But we're not risking the release for sentiment. You know the rules." He did. He also knew the sound Ranger had made earlier, a sound no textbook had ever described. He'd heard animals cry in pain, rage, hunger, but this was something else entirely. It was grief. That night, the rescue center was quieter than usual. The rain had stopped days ago, but a thin mist clung to the treetops. Ethan stayed late again, checking Whisper's vitals. She was stronger now, her tiny paws flexing as she stretched. When she yawned, he caught sight of a tiny pink tongue and laughed softly. "You're tougher than you look." He dimmed the light and turned to leave. That's when he heard it, a heavy thud from outside. Then another. He opened the door to the courtyard and stepped out. Ranger was there, throwing his weight against the side of the enclosure, not in fury, but in desperation. Each strike of his shoulder against the wire made the gate rattle. "Hey!" Ethan called, running closer. "Stop that!" Ranger froze at his voice, panting hard. The bobcat's chest rose and fell with a wild rhythm, but his eyes weren't on Ethan. They were fixed on the treatment building, on the window that glowed faintly with Whisper's incubator light. Ethan's heart squeezed. He could see it now, the same longing that had haunted Ranger's every movement since that night. "You miss her," he whispered. The bobcat stepped closer to the fence, his breath fogging the wire. For a moment, their eyes locked. Man and creature, reason and instinct, standing on opposite sides of a line neither could cross. Ethan turned and went back inside. He found Nora in her office, writing up the day's report. "He's not calming down," he said. "He's going to hurt himself." Nora sighed. "Ethan, I know the rules," he interrupted, "but he's breaking down out there. He needs to see her, even for a minute." She looked up, eyes narrowing. "You're asking me to put a fragile kitten near a full-grown bobcat?" "With a barrier," he said. "Just for the night. If I'm wrong, I'll take the blame." For a long moment, the only sound was the clock ticking on the wall. Nora's shoulders slumped. "1 hour," she said finally. "And if anything goes wrong, I'll end it myself," Ethan promised. They moved quietly through the dim hallway, carrying the incubator back toward Ranger's pen. Nora's jaw was tight, her hands steady in the way only someone masking fear could manage. When they reached the enclosure, Ethan set the incubator down a few feet from the mesh. Ranger froze. His ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring. Then he stepped closer, lowering himself to the ground until he was eye level with the small glass box. Inside, Whisper stirred, eyes blinking open. She made a faint, questioning sound. The bobcat answered with a soft chuff, his tail flicking once. Nora stood behind Ethan, speechless. Ranger's muscles relaxed, his breathing slowed. He lay down fully, pressing his massive body against the fence as close as he could get. Whisper crawled toward the side of the incubator, tiny paws pressed against the glass. The distance between them was only inches, metal and plastic dividing what instinct had already joined. Ethan swallowed hard. You see that? He's not aggressive. He just needed to know she was still here. Nora didn't respond. Her hand had gone to her chest without her realizing, as if steadying her own heartbeat. After an hour, Ranger was asleep. The first true sleep he'd had in days. Whisper, too, was still. The rhythmic rise and fall of their breathing fell into sync, slow and even. When Nora finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper itself. Move her back in the morning. Just tonight. Ethan nodded, relief flooding through him. They left the room in silence, but neither could shake the feeling that something profound had taken place. Something they couldn't name, but both understood. Outside, the night deepened. The lights in the enclosure cast long shadows over the ground, and in that quiet space between them, two creatures slept. One wild, one helpless, their hearts beating, impossibly, to the same rhythm. And though Nora would never admit it aloud, she knew the rules she had built her life upon had just begun to tremble. The rain had long since stopped, but its scent lingered on the wind. Damp earth, pine resin, and something metallic, like the breath of a forest waking from a long sleep. Inside Silverpine Wildlife Rescue, the world had gone still. The steady hum of the incubator blended with the soft hiss of the heating vents, forming a lullaby that seemed to cradle the entire building. Nora sat in her office, unable to sleep. Her glasses rested beside a stack of case files she wasn't reading. Every few minutes, she found herself glancing toward the surveillance monitor on the wall. It showed two separate feeds, Ranger's enclosure on one screen and the treatment room on the other. The images flickered in the dim light. Two small frames, two steady heartbeats. Ranger hadn't moved since they'd left him. He was curled against the fence, his breathing slow and even, one paw stretched out toward the incubator beyond the wire. Inside the glass box, Whisper slept as well, her tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Nora watched for nearly an hour before rubbing her eyes. You're losing it, she muttered to herself. They're just animals. But her voice lacked conviction. Down the hall, Ethan couldn't sleep either. He sat by the treatment room door, a blanket over his shoulders, listening to the faint hum of machines. He'd promised Nora he would keep an eye on them, though he knew he would have stayed even without the order. Something about the fragile connection between those two creatures tugged at him, a reminder of how easily survival could depend on something as simple as warmth and presence. Near midnight, Whisper stirred. Her tiny paws twitched under the blanket, and a faint, raspy mew broke the silence. Before Ethan could even rise, a sound answered from outside, a deep, throaty purr that vibrated through the thin metal walls. Ranger was awake. Ethan glanced toward the window. In the faint light, he could just make out the bobcat's silhouette, broad shoulders hunched, ears pricked toward the building. The big cat let out another low sound, softer now, more of a hum than a call. Whisper responded with a faint chirp, her voice no stronger than a whisper, but enough. Ethan stood there, transfixed, watching an invisible conversation unfold between them. Each time Whisper made a noise, Ranger replied, the sounds syncing in a pattern that felt ancient, instinctive, something older than either of them. Ethan stepped closer to the window, his breath fogging the glass. "You can't see her," he murmured, "but you know she's there." Ranger's tail flicked once, as if acknowledging him. Then he lay down again, still facing the room. By 2 a.m., the building had fallen completely silent. Nora's monitor showed nothing but still figures bathed in soft light. Yet something about the scene unsettled her. Not fear, but awe. She'd spent decades studying animal behavior, yet this defied the textbooks. There was empathy in the bobcat's stillness, patience in his restraint. At 3, Ethan heard the kitten's breathing change. The soft, even rhythm faltered. Whisper's body trembled. He rushed to her side, checking the thermometer on the incubator. Her temperature was dropping. "Come on, kid," he murmured, adjusting the heating pad and wrapping her tighter in the towel. "Stay with me." He called Nora immediately. Within minutes, she appeared in the doorway, robe thrown over her scrubs, hair pulled back in haste. "What happened?" "Her temp's falling again. I can't keep it steady." Nora's hands moved fast, efficient despite the hour. She checked the IV line, the fluids, the heat source. "She's crashing," she said quietly. Ethan's heart sank. "After all this?" "Neonates this week can relapse without warning." Nora's voice softened. "You know that." Whisper let out a faint cry, the smallest sound, yet it filled the room with unbearable weight. Then, through the walls, came an answer. Ranger's roar wasn't a full-throated one. It was low, guttural, raw, a sound born of distress rather than anger. He began pacing along the fence, the dull thud of his paws echoing like a heartbeat gone frantic. Nora froze, listening. "He knows," Ethan whispered. "He knows something's wrong." "That's impossible." "Then listen," Ethan said, eyes fierce. "Tell me that's coincidence." The bobcat's pacing grew faster, his voice louder. He pressed against the mesh, calling again and again, and with each call, Whisper's tiny ears twitched. Her eyes fluttered open. Ethan stared at the monitors. "Her vitals. They're responding." Nora leaned closer. The readings were stabilizing, just barely. Heartbeat climbing, temperature rising by a fraction. It made no sense, yet there it was, glowing red and undeniable. Ethan looked up at her. "Let me bring her closer." "No," Nora's tone cracked. "That's against every protocol we have." "She'll die if we don't." "And if he hurts her?" Ethan hesitated. He looked toward the door, where the sounds of Ranger's calls still rolled through the corridor, mournful but steady. "He won't." Nora closed her eyes for a long moment, weighing logic against the quiet voice that whispered trust. "We keep the barriers," she said finally. "Not an inch closer." Together, they carried the incubator down the hall, the soft hum of machinery cutting through the darkness. Ranger was waiting. When he saw them, he stopped pacing and pressed close to the fence, muscles trembling. Ethan set the incubator on the ground, just a few feet away. "Easy, boy," he murmured. The bobcat's breathing slowed. He crouched, lowering his head to the mesh. Through the glass of the incubator, Whisper stirred again. Her tiny body shifted, nose twitching as if she recognized something in the air. Then, for the first time, she purred, a weak, broken sound, but unmistakably alive. Ranger answered instantly, a deep rumble that resonated through the room like thunder beneath the floor. The kitten relaxed, her body sinking into the warmth of the blanket. The monitor beeped steadily, a soft reassurance of returning life. Ethan looked at Nora, voice trembling. "She's coming back." Nora didn't speak. She was staring at Ranger, at the way his eyes softened, at how his tail flicked once, twice. Not the movements of a predator, but of something gentler. They stayed like that until sunrise. The bobcat never moved from his place beside the fence. Whisper slept soundly for the first time in hours. When the first pale light of dawn seeped through the windows, Nora stepped closer to the incubator, her voice a whisper. "I can't explain this." "You don't have to," Ethan said quietly. "Just let it happen." Outside, the forest began to wake. Crows called from the treetops, and the last of the fog burned away under the rising sun. Inside Silverpine, time seemed to slow. The kind of moment so delicate it felt like the world was holding its breath. Nora leaned against the doorframe, exhaustion washing over her. She watched the bobcat through the mesh, the kitten through the glass, and thought of every rule, every regulation she'd lived by. Distance protects, emotion clouds judgment. Wild must remain wild. Yet here they were, proving her wrong with every breath they took. By mid-morning, Whisper's condition had stabilized completely. She was stronger, her heartbeat steady. Nora turned off the emergency heating unit and straightened, her eyes meeting Ethan's. "She'll live," she said softly. Ethan smiled for the first time in days. Thanks to him. Nora didn't argue. She only looked toward the enclosure, where Ranger still lay, eyes half closed, the sun glinting off his fur. He seemed content, almost peaceful. "Move her back tonight," she said at last. "We can't keep bending the rules forever." Ethan nodded, though he didn't believe she meant it. Something had shifted in her voice, a crack in the wall that might never close again. As the day stretched on, the ordinary hum of the rescue returned. But in one quiet corner of Silverpine, a bond had taken root. Fragile, improbable, and alive. That night, when Nora reviewed her notes, she paused at the section labeled Behavioral Anomalies. Subject Ranger. After a long moment, she set down her pen and simply wrote 3 words. He chose love. The words looked out of place on the page, too personal, too emotional, as if they had slipped out of her subconscious before reason could stop them. She stared at them for a long while, then closed the file. Outside her office window, the forest lay in soft moonlight, silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl. Somewhere beyond the trees, the wild world waited, a place governed by instinct, not sentiment. Yet tonight, she wasn't sure which of the two had more power. By morning, the entire center knew something extraordinary was happening. Whisper's recovery had defied every medical expectation, and Ranger's behavior had grown even more perplexing. He no longer reacted to other animals or to the staff's movements. His focus was singular. Whenever Whisper stirred or cried, he would lift his head, call softly, and settle again once she quieted. Even the most experienced handlers had never seen anything like it. "You're telling me he stopped pacing as soon as he heard her voice?" asked Tom Redford, Silverpine's senior wildlife rehabilitator, as he leaned over Nora's desk. "That's not normal behavior." Nora sighed. "I know it's not normal, Tom. That's the problem. What do you want to do?" "I've already made the call." She gestured to the phone on her desk. "Dr. Avery Lang is coming in from the State University this afternoon." Tom raised an eyebrow. "The behaviorist?" "Yes, she's publishing a study on cross-species empathy in mammals. If anyone can make sense of this, it's her." Tom leaned back, arms crossed. "And if she can't?" Nora hesitated. "Then we'll treat it as an outlier, a rare, unrepeatable incident." She didn't say what both of them were thinking, that the case might attract attention far beyond their quiet facility. For a rehabilitation center that prided itself on professionalism and scientific integrity, any hint of emotional anthropomorphism could jeopardize funding, permits, even their credibility. When Dr. Avery Lang arrived just after lunch, the air in the office seemed to change. Tall and composed, with her gray-streaked hair tied neatly at her neck, she carried the calm authority of someone who had seen every kind of animal behavior and dismissed most of it as pattern and conditioning. She greeted Nora and Ethan with a polite smile. "I understand you're dealing with an unusual case." "That's one way to put it," Ethan said, leading her toward the observation wing. They stopped outside Ranger's enclosure. Through the mesh, the bobcat was visible, stretched out near the fence, tail flicking lazily. His food dish sat untouched. "He's fixated," Nora explained. "Won't eat unless the kitten's nearby. When we moved, her back last night, his distress levels dropped immediately." Dr. Lang adjusted her glasses. "And the kitten?" "Stable now," Ethan said. "Thriving, actually. Her recovery started the night we placed her near him." Lang made a small sound of interest and began taking notes. "Describe his vocalizations." "Low-pitched chuffing, sometimes a continuous purr when she's sleeping." Lang nodded. "That's typically used by females with cubs to reassure them." "You're sure this animal's male?" "Positive," Nora replied. "We neutered him during treatment." The behaviorist studied Ranger for a moment longer. "I'd like to observe both subjects together." Nora hesitated. "With barriers only." "Of course." They moved Whisper's incubator to the observation room and set it near the wire mesh. As soon as Ranger saw the small white shape through the glass, he rose to his feet. His posture changed instantly. Ears forward, body low, pupils dilated. Ethan tensed, but Dr. Lang raised a hand. "Relax. Watch." Ranger let out a sound, soft, rhythmic, almost melodic. The kitten stirred and mewed, pressing her tiny face toward the side of the incubator. Ranger crouched, his large paw extending toward the mesh, claws retracted. Lang's expression shifted from curiosity to astonishment. "He's self-regulating his stress response," she murmured. "This isn't aggression, it's caregiving behavior." Nora exhaled slowly. "That's what we thought. But this level of interspecies empathy is unprecedented," Lang continued. "Bobcats are solitary by nature, even toward their own kind outside of mating or rearing." She scribbled furiously in her notebook. "Has there been any prior exposure to domestic felines?" "None that we know of," Nora said. "He was captured in the wild, miles from human habitation." Lang frowned. "Then this defies natural explanation." The observation continued for another hour. Each time Whisper shifted, Ranger would respond with a sound. Low, soothing, like a heartbeat translated into breath. When she quieted, he stilled. The harmony between them was unmistakable. Afterward, Lang joined Nora and Ethan in the staff room. "I can't give you a definitive answer yet," she said, flipping through her notes. "But there's mounting evidence that trauma can rewire behavioral patterns in surprising ways. Loss, for instance, can trigger redirected nurturing instincts." "You think he's experienced loss?" Nora asked. "It's possible. A mate, a sibling, something that awakened dormant empathy." Ethan spoke quietly. "Or maybe he just remembers what it means to care." Lang smiled faintly. "You sound like a poet, Mr. Cole." "Or someone who's seen too much of both sides," he said, looking toward the window where Ranger now lay watching the tree line. Lang closed her notebook. "I'll be writing a preliminary report. But be warned, once this reaches the academic circuit, you'll have attention from the media. Stories like this travel fast." Nora sighed. "That's what I was afraid of." "Handle it carefully," Lang advised. "Public emotion can be both a blessing and a curse. Don't let sentiment undermine your data." After she left, Ethan lingered by the window. You think she's right? That this is just trauma playing out in weird ways? Nora didn't answer immediately. Maybe. Or maybe we've underestimated what animals are capable of. Ethan smiled. You just said maybe. That's progress. That night, Silver Pine was quieter than usual. The staff had gone home early, shaken by the day's strange beauty. Nora made her final rounds, clipboard tucked under her arm. She stopped at Whisper's room first. The kitten was asleep, tiny body curled against the blanket. Then she walked to Ranger's enclosure. The bobcat was awake, sitting near the fence, watching her approach. Evening, she murmured. You've caused quite a stir today. Ranger blinked slowly, unthreatening. Nora crouched near the mesh. You're supposed to go free tomorrow, she said quietly. Back to the wild where you belong. But now... She trailed off. Now I'm not sure what's right anymore. He tilted his head slightly, as if hearing the doubt in her voice. For a long moment they stayed like that. Two beings separated by steel and species, bound by something that didn't need a name. Later, when Nora returned to her office, she found Ethan sitting on the steps outside, staring at the misty tree line. You ever think, he said without turning, that maybe some bonds aren't mistakes? Maybe they're reminders. Reminders of what? That we're not so different. Nora didn't reply. The words hung between them, heavy with truth. In the enclosure behind them, Ranger settled down for the night. Beyond the walls, Whisper stirred in her sleep, letting out a single soft mew. And though they were separated by distance, doors, and all the rules of the human world, Ranger answered with a low, steady purr that rolled through the darkness like a promise. For Nora, who heard it faintly from her office, the sound carried both awe and unease. It was the kind of moment that couldn't be measured in data or explained by charts. A heartbeat that bridged the gap between science and soul. She turned off the lights and stood for a long time in the doorway, the forest whispering outside, the rhythm of two lives intertwined somewhere behind her. For the first time in her career, Dr. Nora Hayes felt the thin edge of wonder, sharp and terrifying, cut through the walls she'd spent years building, and deep down, beneath all her logic and training, a single thought took root, fragile but impossible to ignore. What if love itself is just another law of nature we haven't learned to name yet? Morning came early at Silver Pine. The forest was still wrapped in mist when the first trucks arrived, headlights cutting through the gray dawn. Today was supposed to be a victory, the kind of day that reminded everyone why they did this work. Ranger, the bobcat who had survived the trap, the surgeries, and months of rehabilitation, was finally strong enough to go home. But the air felt different, too quiet, too heavy. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. Nora stood by the fence, clipboard in hand, watching the team prepare the transport crate. Everything was by the book. Sedation dose calculated, safety locks tested, GPS collar ready for tracking. She had done this countless times before, and yet her stomach twisted as if something in her body already knew what her mind refused to admit. Ethan was by the enclosure, kneeling beside the crate. His hands moved automatically, checking latches, adjusting straps, but his eyes kept flicking toward the treatment building where Whisper slept. He's ready, he said finally, voice low. Nora nodded, though she didn't move. Let's make it quick. Less stress for him. As the team readied the tranquilizer dart, Ranger paced near the far end of the enclosure. His movements were restless but not fearful, more like someone searching for something they'd misplaced. Every few steps, he paused, ears twitching toward the building down the hill. He knows something's off, Ethan murmured. Nora didn't answer. She steadied the dart gun, exhaled, and fired. The soft thwip broke the morning silence. Ranger flinched, then let out a low growl before retreating behind the log pile. Within minutes, his steps slowed, and he lay down, breathing heavy but calm. "Dose is clean," Nora said, her voice all business now. "Let's move." They entered the enclosure carefully. Ethan knelt beside the sedated bobcat, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Easy there, buddy," he whispered. "You're almost free." As they lifted him onto the stretcher, a sound drifted faintly from the treatment wing, soft at first, then clearer. A tiny cry. Whisper was awake. Ethan froze mid-step. "Did you hear that?" Nora hesitated, frowning. "It's just the kitten. Keep moving." But the moment the sound reached Ranger's ears, his body tensed. Even under sedation, his head lifted, eyes half open. His pupils widened, and a deep rumble vibrated in his chest. "He's responding," Ethan said quietly. The kitten cried again, thin, pleading, the sound slicing through the air like a thread of invisible wire. Ranger let out a low, guttural moan, the kind of sound that didn't belong in the realm of science. Then, to everyone's disbelief, he began to move. "Hold him down!" Nora barked. But the sedative should have kept him still for another 20 minutes. Instead, Ranger staggered to his feet, muscles trembling, eyes wild with panic. He looked around frantically, sniffing the air, then turned toward the sound of Whisper's cries. "Ethan, back off!" Nora shouted. But Ethan didn't move. He saw something in those amber eyes, something desperate, familiar. Not aggression, not fear, loss. The bobcat stumbled forward, trying to push through the gate. His body swayed, fighting the drug, claws scraping against the metal. When the staff tried to approach, he let out a warning snarl, not to attack, but to protect. "Doc," Ethan said, voice shaking. "He doesn't want to go." Nora's jaw clenched. "He has to." The team tried again, this time using the net. Ranger thrashed, the strength in his muscles frightening even under sedation. The sound that came out of him wasn't a roar or growl. It was a cry. A low, drawn-out wail that silenced every human in earshot. It was grief made audible. In the distance, Whisper answered, high-pitched, terrified. The two sounds collided in the air, the wild and the fragile merging into something heartbreakingly human. Ethan's chest tightened. He couldn't watch. "Stop," he said hoarsely. "Just stop." "Ethan, stand down," Nora ordered. But he didn't. He took a step toward the crate, his eyes burning. "Look at him, Nora. He's not fighting the sedation. He's fighting the separation." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the kitten's faint cries and the steady thud of Ranger's tail hitting the ground, weak but insistent. Nora's hands trembled around the clipboard. She wanted to argue, to remind them all of the rules, of how dangerous it was to project emotions onto wild animals. But the words wouldn't come. The sight before her had stripped language of its authority. Ranger's strength finally gave out. He slumped onto the crate floor, sides heaving. His eyes, half-lidded now, stayed fixed in the direction of the treatment room. Ethan crouched beside him, voice barely above a whisper. "He can't let her go." Nora exhaled, long and shaky. "Neither can you, apparently." "Maybe that's not the worst thing." She looked away, her throat tight. "We'll postpone the release." "What?" "I said we postpone it," she repeated, louder now. "We need to reassess his behavior before we do anything irreversible." The team exchanged uncertain glances, but no one argued. By the time they returned Ranger to his enclosure, the sedative had nearly worn off. He staggered toward the far wall, the side that faced the treatment wing, and collapsed there, pressing his body against the fence. Ethan stood outside the enclosure, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. Nora joined him, her expression unreadable. "This isn't protocol," she said quietly. "I know." "Then why does it feel like the only right thing to do?" Ethan looked at her. "Because it is." They stayed there until the sun climbed higher, painting the sky gold. For the first time in weeks, Ranger lay still, not sedated, not restless, simply waiting. Inside the treatment room, Whisper slept soundly, unaware of the chaos her small voice had caused. Later that afternoon, Nora sat alone in her office, staring at the report form titled Pre-Release Evaluation. Ranger. Every blank space mocked her. The criteria were clear: physical health, hunting ability, fear of humans. All of it passed with perfect scores. But there was no section for this. No checkbox for the thing that now held Ranger captive more effectively than any fence. Love. The word hovered in her mind again. Unscientific, unquantifiable, yet undeniable. She flipped to a fresh page and began a new note, her handwriting firm this time. Subject exhibits persistent attachment behavior toward domestic feline. Whisper. Removal results in acute distress, suggesting potential psychological dependence. Recommend observation and delay of release. She paused, pen hovering. Then, beneath the formal language, she wrote quietly, almost to herself. Perhaps freedom means something different to him now. Outside, Ethan stood at the window, watching the two enclosures. Ranger's gaze never left the building. The air between them was still, electric. In that moment, even the most practical hearts among them knew this was no accident, no misfiring of instinct. Something had passed between those two creatures, something primal, unlearned, and as old as the earth itself. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge, Nora joined Ethan at the gate. Neither spoke for a while. The forest glowed copper and blue. The sky stretched wide and heavy with quiet. "Do you think he'll ever let her go?" she asked finally. Ethan shook his head. "Maybe that's not what love's supposed to do." Nora looked at the bobcat pressed against the fence, his amber eyes half closed as he listened to the soft hum of the incubator beyond the wall. She didn't know if animals could love in the way humans defined it, but she knew what devotion looked like. And this was devotion in its purest form. When the last of the light faded, she whispered the words that had haunted her since the day began. Maybe freedom isn't always about leaving. The night that followed was thick with silence. No wind, no rain. Just the muted hum of the rescue center's generators and the faint pulse of life within its walls. Nora sat in her office long after the others had gone, the glow from her desk lamp pooling over a mountain of unfinished paperwork. But her mind wasn't on the reports. It was on the two creatures asleep only a few rooms apart. A wild predator who refused to be released, and a fragile kitten whose cry had somehow anchored him to this world. Every rule she'd spent her life defending seemed to be cracking around her. Protocol said that attachment endangered the process of rehabilitation. But what if, she thought, this attachment wasn't a weakness? What if it was the reason they had both survived? Her pen hovered uselessly above the page. She sighed, pushed back from the desk, and walked to the small refrigerator for another cup of coffee. That's when she noticed the faint jingle, a metallic sound from the shelf beside the incubator supplies. She frowned, setting her mug down. The sound came again, soft but clear. When she lifted the corner of a towel, she found it. A tiny, rusted collar. It must have come from Whisper's crate when they first brought her in. The leather was cracked, stiff with age, and the bell hanging from it no longer rang, just a dull rattle when shaken. Still, there was something about it that tugged at her curiosity. Under the film of rust, She could just make out faint engraving on a small metal tag. Nora carried it under the lamp, adjusting her glasses. The letters were nearly gone, but a few remained. Pine Valley Wildlife Program. Cross Foster Project. She froze. The name was familiar. Too familiar. It had been part of a joint research program 3 years ago, before funding cuts forced it to close. She remembered reading about it in a quarterly report. An experimental initiative where domestic kittens were used to help orphaned wild felines nurse and socialize during their first critical weeks of life. The goal had been noble, to save wild orphans by giving them warmth and companionship. But the ethics had been messy. There were fears that such contact blurred natural instincts. Eventually, the project had been shut down, the animals relocated to various facilities, and the files archived. Nora's hands trembled slightly as she held the collar. "No," she whispered, as if saying the word might keep the realization at bay. She turned to her computer and pulled up the old state database. The system took its time to load, creaking under years of disuse. She searched the project name, narrowing the timeline to 3 years prior. A list appeared. Long, detailed, clinical. Litter codes, rescue sites, parental substitutions. Her eyes scanned down the columns until she found it. Subject: Juvenile male bobcat, tag code 47BR. Name: Ranger. Cross-foster pairing, domestic litter C2, Pine Valley. 1 kitten, white female, assigned as behavioral companion. Age: 3 weeks. Her breath caught. The document was dated exactly 3 years ago to the month. Whisper. The same white fur, the same tiny frame. She scrolled further, heart hammering. According to the notes, the kittens had been returned to foster homes after the experiment concluded, while the bobcat, then only a few months old, had been released into monitored woodland territory. No follow-up data existed beyond that. The project had ended, forgotten. Until now. Nora sat back in her chair, the collar still in her hand. Her throat went dry as the realization set in. Ranger hadn't simply recognized the kitten as a generic infant in need. He had recognized her. Or at least, something deep in his memory had. The scent, the sound, the faint bell that used to ring every time she'd shifted beside him in their shared enclosure as babies. The bond between them wasn't unnatural. It was remembered. She rubbed a thumb over the worn metal tag, the faint chime echoing softly in the stillness. "You never forgot her," she murmured. The next morning, Nora called Ethan into her office. He arrived with 2 mugs of coffee, one already half empty. "You look like you haven't slept," he said. "I didn't." She slid the collar across the desk toward him. He picked it up, puzzled. "The kittens?" "It belonged to her, yes. But it's more than that." She pulled up the document on her computer, turning the monitor toward him. Ranger was part of this program, 3 years ago. Cross-fostered with domestic kittens to simulate family units after he lost his mother. Ethan's brow furrowed as he read. "You're saying—" "I'm saying he knew her scent. Maybe not consciously, but somewhere inside him, he remembered. That's why he reacted like he did. Why he wouldn't eat. Why he couldn't be released." She exhaled, her voice dropping. They were family once. Ethan leaned back, stunned. "So all this time we thought it was some miracle, and it was just memory." "Not just memory," Nora corrected. "It's proof that emotion, attachment, whatever we call it, it's not human alone. It's instinct that can survive years, even trauma." Ethan turned the collar in his hands, the bell giving a faint rattle. "You think he remembered the sound?" "I think it reminded him of safety." For a long moment, neither spoke. The office felt too small, too still, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of what she had said. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "What now?" Nora closed the file. "We can't release him. Not like this. If we separate them, he'll deteriorate again. If we send her away, she'll lose what little stability she's gained. So we keep them together? For now," she said. "Until we find another solution." They spent the day observing quietly from the hallway. Ranger was calmer than he had been in days. Whisper had begun exploring the edges of her incubator, batting at the soft lining with growing curiosity. Each time she mewed, Ranger's tail twitched, and he responded with a low purr that carried through the vents. By evening, Nora felt something she hadn't in years: peace. Not scientific clarity or moral justification, but simple peace. As the sky turned gold behind the mountains, Ethan stood beside her at the viewing window. "You know," he said, "if you told this story to anyone outside this place, they wouldn't believe a word." "Maybe that's for the best," she said with a small smile. "The world isn't ready to accept that love doesn't always need to make sense." He nodded slowly. "So what do we tell the board when they ask why the release is delayed again?" Nora looked back at the two figures, the bobcat and the kitten, each resting within sight of the other. "We'll tell them the truth," she said. "That sometimes survival isn't about returning to the wild. Sometimes it's about finding the piece of the world that makes you whole." That night, she sat alone once more, the collar resting on her desk. She turned it over in her hands, the old leather warm from her touch. In the darkness, she thought she heard a faint chime, the echo of a bell that hadn't rung in years, and in another room, behind steel and glass, two lives continued their quiet miracle. One heartbeat echoing another, the memory of a bond once lost finding its way home again. Outside, the forest swayed gently in the wind. The stars shimmered through the tall firs. Somewhere in the wild, nature kept its secrets, but here, within these walls, two of them had already been revealed. The next morning, Silverpine felt different. There was a kind of hush in the air, the kind that comes before a storm, though the sky was perfectly clear. The entire team had gathered in the conference room, the tension palpable. On the table lay Nora's open report, the collar she had found beside it, and the decision that none of them wanted to make. "Postponing the release is one thing," said Tom Redford, the senior rehabilitator. "But indefinite captivity? That's a different story. You're talking about breaking every rule we've set for ourselves." Nora looked tired but resolute. Ranger's not a typical release candidate anymore. His attachment isn't behavioral, it's emotional. Separating them would undo everything we've accomplished. "Emotional?" one of the younger staff members echoed skeptically. "You're saying a bobcat feels love?" "I'm saying he feels something," Nora replied. "Something strong enough to make him risk his life rather than be apart from her." The room went quiet. For a moment, even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed too loud. Ethan sat at the far end of the table, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "She's right," he said. "I've seen soldiers refuse evacuation because they wouldn't leave their brothers behind. You can call it instinct or loyalty, but it's the same force." Nora nodded. "And that's what we're dealing with. Not an anomaly, but a bond." Tom exhaled heavily, folding his arms. "So what's the plan then? Keep them both here forever? We're not a sanctuary, Nora. We don't have the space or the permits." "That's why I made some calls," she said. "There's an alternative." She opened a folder and slid a brochure across the table. On the front, a photo showed a sprawling expanse of green forest and open sky. Willow Sanctuary, a wildlife preserve specializing in non-releasable predators. They have the licenses, the resources, and most importantly, the compassion to handle cases like this. I spoke with the director personally. They're willing to take both Ranger and Whisper, provided we cover transport and transition costs. Ethan glanced at the image, then back at Nora. Together? Together, she confirmed. Tom rubbed his chin. You really think keeping them together is what's best? For him? Nora's voice softened. I think forcing them apart would destroy them both. There were murmurs around the table. Disagreement, uncertainty, reluctant acceptance. The unspoken truth hung between them all. Science had reached its limit. What came next required something less measurable, but perhaps more meaningful. Mercy. By the time the meeting ended, the decision was made. Willow Sanctuary would take them both. The preparations would begin immediately. That afternoon, Nora found Ethan outside Ranger's enclosure. The bobcat was lying near the fence, tail flicking lazily as Whisper played with a feather toy inside the adjacent treatment room. The distance between them was only a few yards, but every sound the kitten made drew Ranger's eyes. He's calm today, Ethan said quietly. He knows, Nora replied. Animals always know when something's changing. Ethan glanced at her. You think this is the right call? She hesitated before answering. I think it's the only one that lets him live with peace instead of loss. He nodded, then looked back at the bobcat. You know, when I got out of the service, I didn't think I'd ever believe in anything like this again. But watching them, it's like being reminded that love isn't something humans invented. Nora smiled faintly. Maybe it's the oldest instinct there is. They stood in silence for a while. In the golden light of late afternoon, Ranger's fur gleamed like copper. Every so often, he would glance toward Whisper, and his chest would rise with a deep, slow breath, steady, certain, alive. The next day brought new visitors to Silver Pine, officials from the State Wildlife Department, there to review the transfer. They inspected the enclosures, the medical charts, and the behavioral notes. Their questions were sharp, clinical, each one a reminder of how fragile compassion could seem in a world governed by procedure. So the bobcat is non-releasable, said the lead officer, a man named Harrison Wells, his tone flat. Due to behavioral dependency on a domestic animal? Nora kept her expression neutral. Due to a documented emotional bond formed during early cross-foster conditioning, separating them would cause measurable distress and threaten recovery. Wells looked unimpressed. That's a stretch, Doctor. Emotional bonds between species? You realize how that sounds to the board? I realize how it looks, she said, her voice calm but firm. And what it looks like is survival. Ethan stepped forward. Sir, with all due respect, I've seen what happens when you take away the one thing keeping someone alive. It's not theory, it's heartbreak. Wells studied them both for a long moment, then sighed. You've got approval for transfer, but if this story gets out, don't expect the state to stand behind you. Nora nodded. We're not doing this for headlines. Good, Wells said, gathering his clipboard. Because compassion doesn't fit neatly into a grant proposal. When he left, Ethan muttered under his breath. Guess not everything has to. That evening, the center was bathed in twilight. Nora walked the corridors slowly, the weight of the day pressing against her chest. She stopped outside Whisper's room, watching the kitten bat at a strip of gauze, oblivious to the world beyond her small enclosure. Hey there, little one, she murmured. Whisper looked up, blinking her pale blue eyes, and mewed softly. Across the hall, Ranger stirred. He rose from his resting spot and pressed himself against the fence, nose twitching toward the sound. Nora turned toward him. One more night, she whispered. Tomorrow, you'll both have a home. Ranger blinked, slow and deliberate, then let out a low, gentle purr that vibrated through the metal. Nora smiled faintly. You always did have good timing. Later, in the staff lounge, Ethan found her staring out the window at the darkening sky. Everything ready? He asked. Yes, she said. The transport arrives at 9. Willow's team will handle intake from there. Ethan handed her a steaming mug of tea. You ever think about what happens after? When they're gone? She took a sip before answering. I think about what they'll teach the people who see them next. He raised an eyebrow. You mean the visitors? I mean the children, she said. The ones who'll grow up seeing that love doesn't need a reason to exist. It just does. Outside, a soft wind moved through the pines, carrying the faint scent of rain. Ethan set down his mug. You ever wonder if the world will catch up to that idea? Eventually, she said with a tired smile. But until then, we just keep proving it one small miracle at a time. That night, Nora walked the grounds one last time. The air was cool, the stars sharp and endless above the dark tree line. In the enclosure, Ranger lay quietly, his gaze fixed on the faint light glowing from Whisper's room. For a while, Nora just stood there, listening to the rhythm of the night. The chirp of crickets, the distant rustle of leaves, the steady beat of two hearts that had somehow found each other in a world too vast for coincidences. When she finally turned to leave, she whispered, Rest easy, both of you. Tomorrow, the world gets to see what love looks like when it refuses to break. And as she walked back toward the main building, a sound drifted through the stillness. A soft chuff from the bobcat, answered by a kitten's sleepy mew. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a promise. The morning broke cold and clear. A thin veil of frost covered the pines outside Silver Pine Wildlife Rescue, and the air smelled of wood smoke and new beginnings. The world seemed to hold its breath. Today was the day. Nora stood by the window of her office, coffee cooling in her hands, watching the transport truck rumble up the long gravel drive. Its metal sides reflected the morning light, bright, sterile, too final. She felt a familiar pang of doubt twist in her chest. After all that had happened, sending them away, even to safety, felt like surrender. Ethan appeared in the doorway behind her, his jacket zipped up against the cold. They're here, he said softly. She nodded, but didn't move. You've checked the transfer crates? Twice, he said. Rangers is reinforced steel mesh with soft bedding, temperature controlled. The sanctuary sent the specs themselves. And Whisper? She'll ride in the climate crate right next to him. He smiled faintly. She won't be out of his sight. Nora turned, finally meeting his eyes. Good. They walked together toward the holding area. The staff had gathered quietly, their usual chatter replaced by solemn murmurs. They all knew this wasn't just another release or transfer. It was the end of something remarkable. Ranger sat near the back of his enclosure, calm but alert. His golden eyes flicked toward the commotion, watching the movement of hands, the quiet clink of locks being unlatched. But the moment Whisper's faint cry echoed from the treatment wing, his ears twitched, and he turned toward the sound. Bring her in, Nora instructed. Ethan nodded to Kayla, the youngest of their staff, who carefully carried the small travel crate through the doorway. Inside, Whisper was awake and curious, tiny nose pressed against the mesh window. Her soft white fur caught the light, glowing like snow in sunlight. When Ranger saw her, something in him changed. His muscles tensed, not with fear, but with recognition. His body lowered, his head tilted slightly, and that deep, resonant chuff rolled from his chest again, as steady as a heartbeat. Whisper responded immediately, letting out a short, chirping mew. She reached one paw toward the mesh of her crate, claws sheathed, as though she could touch him through the air itself. The room fell silent. Even the staff stopped moving. For a long moment, Nora forgot every rule, every policy that had governed her life. The barrier between species, between wild and domestic, between logic and feeling, all of it vanished. "Let's give them a moment," she said quietly. Ethan stepped forward, opening the small viewing panel on Ranger's enclosure and setting Whisper's crate gently beside it. The two were separated by only inches now. Wire and tempered glass, the last fragile divisions between them. Ranger moved first. He pressed his nose to the mesh, his breath fogging the surface. His paw followed, slow and deliberate. Whisper mirrored him, pressing her tiny paw against the same spot. A sound escaped Nora's throat before she could stop it. Half a sigh, half a prayer. Ranger chuffed again, softer this time, his tail flicking once, twice. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he lowered himself onto his belly and extended his paw flat against the ground, claws hidden. It was a gesture every handler recognized: submission, gentleness, trust. Whisper mewed, a soft, contented sound, and rubbed her head against the mesh, eyes half closing. "I've never seen anything like this," Kayla whispered, her voice trembling. Nora didn't answer. She was too busy memorizing every detail: the texture of light across their fur, the steady rhythm of their breathing, the impossible tenderness of it all. After a minute, she spoke. "Open the divider." Ethan looked at her sharply. "You sure? There's no aggression in him. None. If we're ever going to understand this bond, we need to see it without glass between them." He hesitated. Then, slowly, he lifted the sliding gate between the two compartments. The air seemed to hold still. Ranger didn't move at first. He simply watched as the small white kitten stepped cautiously out of her crate, her paws making no sound on the straw-covered floor. She took a few tentative steps forward, tail flicking. When she squeaked, a small, uncertain sound, Ranger lowered his massive head until it nearly touched the ground. Whisper stopped. The two of them stood only a foot apart now, predator and prey in every evolutionary sense of the word. Yet neither seemed to remember which was which. Then, with the slowest, gentlest motion, Ranger stretched his neck forward and touched his nose to Whisper's head. It was a moment suspended in time. No one breathed. Whisper responded with a tiny trill and leaned into him, her body trembling, but not with fear. Ranger's tongue flicked out once, carefully, grooming her ear. Then he circled her once, a protective arc, before settling on the ground. Whisper climbed onto his foreleg, kneaded twice with her paws, and curled against his chest. The room erupted into stunned silence. Ethan's eyes glistened. Nora's hand covered her mouth. "He's holding her," Ethan said quietly. "He's really holding her." Nora felt tears sting the corners of her eyes, though she didn't wipe them away. "No," she whispered. "He's protecting her." Ranger shifted slightly, careful not to disturb the kitten. His massive paw came down gently, draping over her like a living blanket. The two of them breathed together, one wild, one fragile, in perfect harmony. For Nora, years of rigid scientific training unraveled in that single instant. All her carefully kept distance, all her fear of sentiment, seemed meaningless now. She finally understood. This wasn't a story about taming the wild or domesticating nature. It was about recognizing the thread that connected them all. After several minutes, Nora nodded to Ethan. "That's enough. We've seen what we needed to see." He hesitated. "Do you want me to separate them?" She looked at the sleeping kitten nestled against the bobcat's chest. "Not yet," she said softly. "Just not yet." The transport team waited patiently as the morning wore on. When Ranger finally stirred, Whisper followed his movements, climbing onto his back as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Nora knew that breaking this bond now would be cruel, perhaps even fatal. By noon, both animals were loaded carefully into their adjoining crates. The team secured them side by side inside the truck. Through the small viewing windows, Whisper could see Ranger's silhouette, and he could hear her breathing. They calmed instantly once reunited. As the truck doors closed, Nora rested her hand against the cold metal. "Take care of each other," she whispered. Ethan stood beside her, his voice thick. "Think they know where they're going?" Nora smiled faintly. "I think they only care that they're going together." The truck rumbled down the long drive, disappearing between the trees. For a long time after, Nora and Ethan stood there in the clearing, listening to the echoes fade into the forest. When the sound was gone, Nora exhaled slowly. "All my life," she said, "I thought our job was to teach animals to survive without us. Maybe it's the other way around." Ethan turned to her, brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She met his gaze. "Maybe they're here to remind us how to feel, how to care without asking why." As they walked back toward the building, the first snowflakes of late winter began to fall. Soft, drifting, silent. The world seemed at peace. Miles away, the truck continued its journey through the winding mountain roads, carrying its precious cargo toward Willow Sanctuary. Inside, the kitten slept pressed against the wall of her crate, purring softly. On the other side, the bobcat's deep rumble answered, steady and sure. 2 hearts, 2 lives, 1 rhythm, and somewhere in the space between them, love, wild, unspoken, and eternal, kept its quiet vigil. 6 months later, spring had returned to the Cascade foothills, painting the valleys in green and gold. The snowmelt fed the rivers, and the scent of new pine needles hung in the air. A warm wind carried birdsong over the sprawling acres of Willow Sanctuary, where the wild and the wounded found a second chance at life. From the outside, the sanctuary looked like a dream. Open forests, soft meadows, and winding trails that blended into the foothills beyond. But to those who worked there, it was more than a refuge. It was a place where stories that once ended in tragedy found quieter, better endings. On the far side of the preserve, beyond the aviaries and fox dens, sat the largest enclosure. Nearly an acre of forest fenced with mesh that shimmered in the sunlight. Inside it lived 2 unlikely residents, whose story had already begun to make its way through whispers, letters, and quiet astonishment. A full-grown bobcat named Ranger, and a domestic cat named Whisper. Nora stepped out of the staff truck, boots crunching softly on gravel. The drive from Silverpine had taken almost 3 hours, but she didn't mind. It was the first time she'd been back since the transfer. She had told herself the visit was professional, a follow-up, a welfare check, but in truth, it was something closer to longing. Ethan was already waiting by the gate, leaning against the railing, with that easy stillness she'd come to recognize. His hair was longer, his face more weathered from the months spent outdoors. He smiled when he saw her. "You made it." "I wasn't going to miss this," she said. They walked together toward the enclosure, where the air was rich with the earthy scent of cedar and moss. The sound of distant water trickled through the quiet. Through the mesh, Nora saw them. 2 figures resting side by side under a low pine. Ranger, larger now, his coat thick and glossy. Whisper, small but sturdy, curled against his flank like a patch of snow on fur. For a moment, Nora couldn't breathe. It was one thing to believe their bond had survived the move, another to see it thriving with her own eyes. Ethan opened the visitor gate, stepping into the observation area. "You should see what they've built here," he said softly. "The staff calls them the heart exhibit. Visitors can't get close, but everyone stops here. Some cry, some just stare. Nobody leaves untouched." Nora smiled faintly. "I can imagine." They stood in silence for a while, watching as Ranger shifted his weight, wrapping his tail loosely over Whisper's back. The kitten, though she was nearly grown now, stretched, kneaded his fur twice, and settled again. "She doesn't go anywhere without him," Ethan said. "If he climbs the log structure, she follows halfway up and waits until he comes down. If she's out of sight too long, he calls for her." Nora folded her arms. "It's like they found balance, predator and prey learning how to exist together." "Not prey," Ethan corrected. "Partners." From somewhere behind them came the sound of footsteps. Lisa Townsend, the director of Willow Sanctuary, approaching with her ever-present clipboard. Her calm, sun-weathered face broke into a smile when she saw Nora. "Dr. Hayes?" she greeted warmly. "I'm glad you came. I thought you'd want to see this for yourself." "I wouldn't have believed it otherwise," Nora admitted. Lisa nodded toward the enclosure. "They've become our main draw, but more importantly, they've become something we can't quite define. People come here expecting to see wild animals behind fences. What they see instead is connection. It changes them." Ethan looked out toward the pair again. Sometimes that's all it takes, a reminder. Lisa motioned for them to follow her to the observation deck overlooking the habitat. On the far end, a small group of school children stood pressed against the viewing glass, their teacher speaking softly. "Why doesn't the big cat hurt the little one?" one child asked. The teacher smiled. "Because some hearts recognize family, no matter what they look like." Nora felt her throat tighten. The group fell silent as Ranger rose and stretched, his powerful muscles rippling under his coat. Whisper followed, weaving between his legs, brushing against him with effortless trust. Together they walked toward the shallow pond that glimmered in the sunlight. Ranger crouched beside it, drinking, while Whisper pawed playfully at the ripples. The sight drew gasps from the children, not of fear but wonder. "Look," one whispered. "He's watching out for her." Nora leaned against the railing, tears stinging her eyes. "Do you ever get used to it?" she asked Lisa quietly. Lisa shook her head. "No, and I hope I never do." For a while they simply watched. The wind stirred the pine branches overhead, carrying birdsong through the enclosure. Whisper chased a falling cone, batting it across the grass. Ranger followed at a slow, deliberate pace, his gaze soft, a guardian disguised as a hunter. Ethan turned toward Nora. "You ever think about how it started? One night, one storm, one act of compassion." "I think about it every day," she admitted. "It changed everything I thought I knew about this work, about myself." Lisa smiled. "That's the thing about miracles, Nora. They don't announce themselves. They just happen quietly, and then they never leave you." Nora looked back at Ranger and Whisper, now curled again under the tree, the sunlight warming their fur. "They didn't just save each other," she said softly. "They saved all of us, in their own way." Ethan chuckled quietly. "You sound like me now." "Maybe you were right all along," she said, smiling, faintly. "Maybe it's not our job to teach animals how to survive without love. Maybe it's to remember that love is survival." A soft murmur ran through the group of visitors as a little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve, pointing at the pair through the glass. "Mommy, look! The big cat's hugging the little one." Her mother smiled, eyes shining. "Yes, sweetheart. He's keeping her safe." Something about the simplicity of the child's words broke the dam inside Nora. All the months of tension, the sleepless nights, the endless arguments with logic and law, they dissolved in a single breath. She turned away from the glass, wiping her eyes. "They belong here," she said to Lisa. "You've given them exactly what they needed." Lisa nodded. "And in return, they've given us something we didn't even know we were missing." Before leaving, Nora walked one last time to the fence line. Ranger looked up, sensing her presence. For a moment their eyes met through the mesh, the wild, steady gaze of a creature who had once been broken, now whole again. "Hello, old friend," she whispered. "You did it." Ranger blinked slowly, then pressed his head gently against the fence. Whisper followed, brushing her tiny nose against the same spot. Ethan placed a hand on Nora's shoulder. "You know," he said quietly, "if you tell people about this, some will call it fantasy." "Then let them," she replied. "Some truths are too beautiful to need proving." They stood there for a long while, the breeze moving softly through the pines. Somewhere nearby, a camera clicked, a visitor capturing the image that would later circle the world. A wild bobcat and a small white cat resting together beneath the same tree, their bodies forming the shape of a heart. When Nora and Ethan finally turned to leave, the sound of Whisper's purr followed them, soft, rhythmic, and alive. For everyone who witnessed that day, it was more than a moment. It was a lesson whispered through fur and sunlight, through the eyes of two creatures who had defied nature itself to find each other again. And as Nora walked down the path, the children's voices echoed faintly behind her. "If a bobcat can love a kitten," one of them said, "then maybe people can too." Nora smiled through her tears. "Maybe they can," she whispered to herself. "Maybe they just needed to be reminded." The wind stirred once more through the trees, carrying with it the soft chorus of purrs and chuffs from the enclosure. The music of two souls who had turned survival into love, and love into legacy. Time moved quietly after that. Seasons shifted, and life at Silver Pine returned to its usual rhythm. New rescues arrived: injured eagles, orphaned fox kits, fawns found on back roads. And Nora found herself immersed again in the endless cycle of healing, releasing, and letting go. Yet every time the evening grew still and the shadows lengthened across the yard, her thoughts would drift back to Willow Sanctuary. 6 months had passed since her visit, and though she had stayed busy, she never stopped wondering. Were they still together? Had Whisper grown strong? Did Ranger still keep his silent watch beside her? The answer came one quiet morning in late April. Nora was sorting through intake forms when the receptionist appeared in the doorway, holding a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Something came for you," she said. "No return address, just says Willow." Nora's heart skipped a beat. She set her paperwork aside and took the package carefully. The handwriting on the label was neat, old-fashioned. Inside was a bound photo album wrapped in tissue paper and a letter written in graceful cursive. She unfolded the first page. "Dear Nora, I thought you might want to see how our most remarkable residents are doing. It's been nearly a year since they arrived, and every day they continue to teach us something new about trust, memory, and devotion. Ranger and Whisper are thriving, inseparable as ever. What began as a curiosity has become the heart of this sanctuary. People come here not to watch wildlife, but to remember kindness. You once told me love might be a law of nature. After watching them for months, I'm convinced you were right. With gratitude, Lisa Townsend." Nora smiled, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the first page of the album. The opening photograph nearly took her breath away. Ranger lay stretched on a sunlit rock, his powerful frame relaxed, eyes half closed. Perched atop his shoulder was Whisper, no longer the fragile scrap of fur Nora remembered, but a graceful young cat, her coat gleaming white against the bobcat's golden fur. The next page showed them at play. Whisper batting at a fallen leaf while Ranger crouched behind her, pretending to pounce. Another image captured them sharing a bowl of water, Whisper's tiny reflection shimmering beside his. But the one that brought tears to Nora's eyes was near the end. a candid shot taken through the glass of the observation deck. Ranger stood under a pine tree, head tilted toward Whisper as she rubbed against his chest. The caption beneath read, "Unlikely family." For a long moment, Nora just sat there. The room silent except for the hum of the overhead lights. Then she noticed something tucked inside the back cover of the album, a folded newspaper clipping from the Oregonian. She unfolded it and began to read. Unlikely family, the Bobcat who adopted a kitten. By Sarah Michaels, staff writer. At Willow Sanctuary, a wild bobcat and a domestic cat have formed an extraordinary bond that has captured hearts around the nation. Their story, now known to thousands through photographs and visitor accounts, began in a small wildlife rescue in Washington, where the pair first met under unusual circumstances. Experts describe their connection as behaviorally unique, but to those who see them together, it's simpler than that. It's love, pure, quiet, and steadfast. Visitors often remark on the serenity of the pair. Ranger, once wary of humans, now spends his days lounging in the sun, while Whisper curls against his side. Staff members say his stress markers have vanished, his health better than ever. It's as if he found what he was searching for, says director Lisa Townsend. And she, in her own way, found home. Their story has inspired donations and awareness for wildlife rehabilitation across the state, funding care for dozens of new rescues this year alone. But beyond science or charity, their bond has become something rarer. A reminder that compassion transcends boundaries, that even the wildest hearts remember kindness when they see it. Nora set the clipping down, her throat tightening. She looked at the final photo in the album. Ranger and Whisper lying together under the same pine tree, framed by sunlight filtering through the leaves. The caption beneath, written in Lisa's looping hand, read, "Because love remembers." Nora closed the album gently and leaned back in her chair. The memories rushed back. The night of the storm, the trembling kitten in Ethan's hands, Ranger's first cry through the darkness. She could still hear that sound, deep and resonant, the voice of something ancient and eternal. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, spilling golden light through her office window. Dust motes swirled like tiny stars. For the first time in months, Nora let herself simply sit in that warmth, smiling through her tears. Later that day, Ethan stopped by the office, his boots muddy from the trail. He found her sitting quietly, the album open in her lap. "Got something from Willow?" he asked. Nora nodded, handing him the letter and photos. He flipped through them slowly, his expression softening. "They look happy." "They are," she said, "more than I ever thought possible." He lingered on one picture. Ranger sprawled on a high platform, Whisper sitting primly beside him. "You know," Ethan said, "people talk about miracles like they're things that fall out of the sky. But sometimes they're just choices. Someone decided to listen that night instead of following the rules. Someone decided to care." Nora smiled faintly. "And someone decided to believe." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them staring at the images of the two animals who had changed their lives in ways words could barely describe. When Ethan stood to leave, he looked back at her. "You still think freedom isn't about leaving?" She met his eyes. "Now I think it's about finding where you belong." That evening, after everyone had gone home, Nora stepped outside. The air was cool and clear, the scent of pine heavy in the breeze. She walked down the familiar path to the edge of the forest, where the first storm had once raged, where a frightened kitten's cry had rewritten everything she believed about the wild. She closed her eyes and listened, not for thunder or wind, but for the quiet sounds that had once filled the rescue. The soft mew, the answering purr, the rhythm that had bridged two worlds. In that stillness, she could almost hear them again. Ranger's low chuff, whisper's delicate reply, carrying across the miles like an echo through time. When she opened her eyes, the last light of day was fading beyond the mountains. She stood there a while longer, smiling through the ache of memory. "Rest well, both of you," she whispered. "You've taught us enough for one lifetime." As she turned back toward the lights of the rescue center, a single leaf drifted down, catching the glow of the porch lamp before settling at her feet. White, soft, and shaped almost like a heart. Somewhere far away, under the wide Oregon sky, two silhouettes rested together in the fading light. A bobcat and a cat, side by side, their bodies forming the same unspoken symbol of what they had always known. Because love, whether wild or gentle, never really disappears. It waits, it endures, and when the world is ready, it remembers. And maybe in stories like this, we remember too. If this bond between a wild bobcat and a tiny kitten touched your heart, let us know below. Just drop a 1 in the comments if you believe love can cross any boundary, or a 0 if you think it's simply nature's way of healing itself. Your voice keeps these stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for the next true story that will warm your heart, one wild miracle at a time.